had an Indaba with Riccardo Spagni, a fellow South African down in Plettenberg Bay. He's the ex-lead maintainer of the Monero privacy-preserving cryptocurrency, and now has handed that off to the Monero community. And he's now working on a new project called Tari. In this Indaba, we talk about the privacy-preserving features. We go into each of the different 5 points of how it works. We also talk about the open source protocol, like the contract, the C4, how it works with Monero. We also go into his sort of life in general. We talk about problems relating to the internet, where it is at the moment, how it's kind of dangerous for us to be using these sorts of systems, especially with data dissemination monopolies. We talk about layer 2 technology on Bitcoin, and there are 2 technical problems that happen at this point. The second one, not much information is lost, but on the first technical glitch, excuse me, Jitsi cuts out, and we lose a little bit of information. During that transition, you will see me come in again, and I will fill in that information as I'm sort of doing now. And then we'll continue on with the Indaba. Without further ado, hope you enjoy this. Good having you on, man.
Yeah, good to be on.
It's 9 o'clock in the morning your side, so you've probably just woken up and barely compos mentis.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm on my 3rd cup of coffee, so it's all good.
Brilliant, man. Yeah, no, I ran out of coffee this morning after the second grinding, and I thought, oh shit, damn it. So there was a sachet of mock or something. So that'd have to do.
Scraping the bottom of the barrel. I've been there.
Just popped out. No, I mean it's great. I'm really glad that you said you agreed to doing an Indaba with this. I mean, it's so rare to find people that are in the privacy space that are actually developing tools and techniques for other people to, well, privacy essentially is kind of like human dignity, right? And there's a lot of misconceptions out there about privacy, and I think it's pretty good, given that the current political circumstances, as well as the structure of the internet, the way things are moving. I think it's a good idea that we sort of maybe get into this subject, talk more deeply about it. Now you've got a bit of a background in one of my respected cryptocurrencies, which is Monero, and this is a privacy-oriented coin. Or privacy-preserving coin. Maybe you could sort of give us the high-level view. And by the way, we don't mind going into really technical detail. So this is not for your the high-level stuff. You can go. We can really start ripping. Take it away.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, do you want to know Monero's history, or do you want to know more how it works?
I think let's look at more how it works. I think I've listened to a couple of podcasts before where you've described the history. And I mean, there was one particular podcast where you went into 5 different points and how Monero does privacy preserving. Yes. And I think it might be good to sort of go into each one of those things.
That's 100%. And I think that's always a good starting point, is not so much how Monero has worked in the past, how Monero works today, which is very relevant. So I've actually, I've thought a lot about the different aspects of privacy. And I've sort of boiled it down to these 5 areas that Monero concentrates on. And I think that this doesn't speak to things like decentralization. You could achieve all 5 of these while still being centralized. And there are models that are built around having a centralized service, but that centralized service doesn't store any data. So if you think about things like DigiCash, that was designed around like, we can provide privacy, but we're a centralized service. And I think that I don't want to discredit things that are more centralized, but I think there's incredible power in decentralization, because decentralization gives you something in addition to privacy, and that is, it makes it permissionless. And so there are certainly people using Monero today that do things that I think are dumb, or do things that I think are that I do not agree with morally. The wonderful thing about it is I can't control them. No one can control them. I'm just a software developer. So, even if someone said, please, can you prevent this from happening on Monero? I have no power. I could certainly write code to prevent it, but no one else would run it. So it really is permissionless in a very real sense. Now, to get onto the privacy stuff, so these 5 areas, Monero needs to focus on preventing an attacker from figuring out where transactions are going to, where transactions are coming from, the value of the transaction. Then it needs to focus on protecting the IP address that broadcasts the transaction. And lastly, there's a focus area on creating a very large anonymity set or privacy set. So let's go into those in detail. So how do we protect where transactions going to? So we use something called dual key stealth addresses. And effectively, without getting too deep into the cryptography, we're effectively hashing the destination in a way that only the recipient can figure out that this belongs to them. And we know, anyone who's even vaguely familiar with cryptography will know that a hashing function is not encryption. It's not something that you can decrypt. You actually need to have the original source data to test against the hash to be able to go, okay, cool, this is definitely for me, it's not for anyone else. This is, of course, immensely powerful because it means that there is no way, short of a break in the underlying cryptography, which is very well known and established, there is no way an attacker is going to be able to look at a Monero transaction and say, this is the Monero address that was paid. So that's an incredibly powerful aspect.
That's a shared secret, right? You use a shared secret. Okay.
Yeah. So the dual key aspect is a little bit of cleverness that allows you to have a second key where you establish a shared secret with the recipient, and then you're able to have 2 keys, one that is able to trace the incoming transaction, and then the other one that allows you to spend it. So we call it the view key and the spend key. So the view key gives you the ability to say, like as an example, an auditor could say like, okay, you declared that you bought $100 worth of Monero, prove it. And you can say, here's my view key. And they can see the $100 transaction coming in. And they can see that in that wallet, there hasn't been an additional transaction that you haven't disclosed. So for an auditor, it's really powerful. For a charity, it's powerful as well. Charities can go like, we received $1,000 in Monero donations. And meanwhile, they received $2,000 and just skimmed the $1,000 off the top. Now, with the view key, they can't do that because the view key is indelibly linked to the Monero address, and you can't. It's impossible to have a Monero address with a different view key. It's part of. Literally, the public key for the view key is part of the Monero address. So it's totally, like it's part of it. It's easy for an auditor.
Yeah,
absolutely, and it's easy for an auditor or for the public who are auditing something like a charity to be able to create that link and go like, oh, okay, cool. They claim to have received X. They did in fact receive X. We can prove that cryptographically. We're happy that they're not skimming money off the top. They can they can steal money other ways, but at least we know that particular threat model, cryptographically, we can audit and deal with. Okay, so that's where transactions are going to. Now, the other aspect, another aspect, and before I get to where transactions are coming from, let's talk about amounts. Now, Monero, in its early days, amounts were visible. This is obviously a problem because there's all sorts of things that you can deduce from observing the flow of amounts. And obviously, I think, I'd argue that probably protect or hiding amounts is one of the key aspects of a privacy preserving cryptocurrency, if not the key aspect. Like, hiding amounts almost gets you like 60% of the way there, because then even if someone can deduce or figure out that you withdrew money from an exchange, they don't know how much you withdrew. You could have withdrawn 10 cents. So, it takes away a whole bunch of threat models around an attacker trying to steal your funds and targeted crime and that sort of thing. Now, we do this through something called, it's based on something called confidential transactions, which Greg Maxwell and a few others created initially for Bitcoin. And we modified that and built on top of that to create something called Ring CT, Ring Confidential Transactions. And this hides and obscures Monero transaction amounts. And the big challenge, of course, is you want to try and prevent this from being abused to create money out of thin air. So the way this works is, instead of putting in an amount, you put in something called a commitment. So we use Peterson Commitments, and a commitment is basically like, almost like a promise that, this is the amount. I guess you could almost think of it as like a hash of the amount.
Okay.
It's a representation of the amount instead of the actual amount, and it can't be easily attacked. You can't go and like brute force that and figure out what the amount is. Now, here's the challenge. When you're using commitments, the output needs to be, obviously you don't want to create outputs out of thin air. So if you think about a transaction, you're spending, let's say, 100 Monero as input, and you're creating 100 Monero as outputs. Those two need to cancel each other out. Less the fee, but let's disregard the fee for now. Now, with commitments, the amazing thing about it is you can do arithmetic. So you can say, okay, I add up all of the output commitments, I subtract all of the input commitments, and it equals 0. Now we know that there's nothing created out of thin air. However, here's the problem. A commitment can be a negative number as well, and there'd be no way to tell. So you could go like, oh, I add up all the output commitments, but there's some negative numbers in there, and then I subtract the inputs, and it matches 0. But actually, because I've used negative numbers in the outputs, I've created Monero out of thin air.
Hang about. So you mean the end user will plug in a minus -1 or something like that. Okay.
Exactly. And so the arithmetic would still work, but there would be this like creation of money out of thin air. So obviously that's deeply problematic. So there's this additional thing called range proofs, and range proofs are just a way to prove that the number is within a range, and the commitment is within a range. And so all it does is it just validates that the number is above 0. That's all it does. And range proofs are kind of chunky. They're pretty big. So this is the sort of combination. You've now got okay, here are all my commitments as inputs, here are all my commitments as outputs. Here are the range proofs covering it to prove that these are all positive numbers, and the total of the outputs less the total of the inputs is 0. So I know no money is being created out of thin air. Now, range proofs are very well established in cryptography. This is not newfangled stuff. It's been around for a long time. What is new and is used on Monero is something called bullet proofs. And this is a very compact range proof that can be, there's a whole bunch of clever tricks that are used to validate the range proofs very quickly. It's made Monero transactions much smaller. When they were introduced, it reduced the transaction size by like 80%, the average transaction size.
Okay.
So bulletproofs are fantastic. There's a new thing coming into Monero soon, I reckon probably within the next 12 months or so, busy being audited now, called Bulletproofs Plus. And that introduces just further compactness and validation speed ups. So this is all about hiding the amount that's being transacted.
Yeah. That's the from, the to and the from. No, you're about to go into the from now.
Well, we're about to go into the from, exactly. So this is to an amount. Now from, okay. So from, we use something called ring signatures. And this is arguably the weakest part of Monero's privacy. It's the one where when people say like, Zcash is more private than Monero, they're only talking about this. They are not talking about any other aspect, because in all other aspects, Monero has the same privacy as something like Zcash, if not more. In fact, in many cases, greater privacy. But at any rate, this is
because of the last one.
Correct, because of the last one. But in this particular instance, ring signatures are where we consider Monero weakest. So the way ring signatures work is very simple. Typically in a transaction, you have an input, and that input links to an output of an older transaction. So, back in block 3,967, there was an output, and now we're spending it as an input. Cool. A ring signature is just a signature that says, out of all of these signatures, one of them is valid, but you can't tell which one is valid. Okay? And so we use that to sign a number of outputs as an input. So we go and we pick 10 outputs from the blockchain plus ours over the whole blockchain history. We go like, here are 10 random blockchain outputs from random transactions and random blocks plus our real one. And an attacker can't figure out which one is the real one. They see all 11. They know that one of them is the valid one, but they cannot deduce which one is the valid one. Now, they can use all sorts of other metadata to try and figure it out. And that's certainly, that's really where the risk comes in. As an example, we've realized over time that a lot of people receive Monero and spend it pretty quickly, like within a day. And you can see these spending patterns on Bitcoin. I mean, Monero's spending patterns are not dissimilar to Bitcoin's. So, you look at that and you go, okay, so what we need to do then is change our output selection. If we just selected randomly from the blockchain, it wouldn't be terrible, but an attacker could just go, okay, it's the recent one. It's always the recent one. And they would be right like 80% of the time. So, it's not a great, that heuristic is problematic. So many years ago, we changed the output selection to a triangular distribution, and then we've refined it further over time. So now it's like heavily weighted towards recent outputs, but it still has some trailing outputs from back in the day. So if someone does come on and they spend an older transaction, like they crack open a 2016 or 2017 Monero wallet, it's still just as well obscured. It's impossible really to differentiate between that and someone who received Monero an hour ago who's now spending it. The transaction, the output selection distribution looks similar, or it's indistinguishable. So that's been kind of important. And there's a whole bunch of research that is done into building out histograms of output selection distribution for Monero transactions, making sure that all the wallets in the ecosystem, and there are many, behave the same way, because otherwise, there's all sorts of metadata that can bleed. So everyone has to follow the same heuristic. And if there's even a small mistake in, someone tries to roll their own heuristic in their wallet, it's going to stick out like a sore thumb. Those transactions are going to be obvious. So it's kind of key that all these transactions look alike. It's very important from a privacy perspective.
So do you have a concern that programmers coming on and implementing other clients and wallets, they might deviate from the thing? So I assume you guys have created this like standard library, and you encourage everybody just include this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that's advantageous is the algorithm for output selection is pretty simple. It's not a long, complicated moon math algorithm. So a developer coming on board who is unfamiliar with it, that implements it themselves, they're not going to struggle. They're able to just take this and go, okay, I get it. I see how this works. It's like 3 lines of code or whatever it is. Like re-implementing that is trivial. In addition to that, there are a bunch of libraries out there. There's a group called the Monero, or one guy really in particular, who has a project called the Monero Ecosystem project, and he's got libraries and bindings for a bunch of languages. C++, Python, Java, whatever. And he's actually implemented the core Monero software into that. So there is no deviation. Anyone who's using that library is implementing all of the cryptography, all of the funny bits, the inconsistencies and nuances as they're implemented in the Monero software.
Nice. Okay.
Cool. So that's 3. So we've covered where a transaction goes to, how we obscure amounts, and where a transaction comes from. Okay, now last 2. IP address. Now, this is something that for a long time we've left rather optional. It's never been difficult to hide your IP address if you're broadcasting a Monero transaction. And in fact, if you're broadcasting a Bitcoin transaction as well, not difficult to obscure. As an example, both Monero and Bitcoin block explorers have something called PushTX. Of course, implemented very differently, but the same basic functionality that you can take the hex version of a transaction, of a raw transaction, and you can just paste it into a text box on the block explorer and hit submit, and the block explorer will go and broadcast it for you. And all of these block explorers are available on Tor. Whether they're natively available on Tor or through exit nodes, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's a signed transaction, so worst case scenario, the only thing they can do is not broadcast it for you. But it's wonderful because you don't actually need to worry about like your node broadcasting it and whether your node is on Tor or I2P or anything. You literally just in your wallet go like, okay, dump this raw TX, and you go and copy and paste it into a block explorer. And that is the way that a lot of people have protected their privacy with Bitcoin and Monero transactions from an IP address perspective for years. Now, more recently, we've realized that, not realized, I mean, we always knew this, but more recently, we've been able to focus a little bit more on how do we inherently protect this? You know, how do we make it a native function so that we're not saying to people like, oh, by the way, if you want to protect the IP address of your transaction, you need to jump through these extra hoops. And this is where something called Dandelion comes on. Now, Dandelion, again, a technology built out for Bitcoin. And you know, there's a BIP for Dandelion, a Bitcoin improvement protocol write-up, not implemented in Bitcoin for a number of reasons, and implemented in Monero for a number of other reasons. You know, I mean, I think the technology is relatively sound. It is it's not an overly complex piece of technology. Effectively, what it does is it's got these two phases, the stem and the fluff phase for transaction broadcast. So the stem phase is where your node says, cool, I've got this transaction that I need to broadcast. So I'm going to send this transaction to one peer in the stem phase. Now that peer then goes on and says, I've received a transaction I need to broadcast. Should I do another stem phase? I'm going to do another stem phase. And it sends it to a single peer.
And this is randomly.
It's random. It's random. Okay. So there's no way to determine. Now, eventually, it hits a node that says,
and then
should I do another stem phase? No, I'm going to do a fluff phase, and then sends it out. So that's the sort of simple explanation of it. And because it's random, there's really no way to tell unless you have like a super majority of nodes, unless you have all like your Sybil attacking the network and you own like 90% of the nodes. There's no way to really be that first recipient of the stem phase. And so it's a pretty powerful technology in and of itself. Now, couple that with the fact that there are a bunch of Monero nodes who are running on Tor, and we've made running on Tor really easy. It really does change the landscape with regards to IP address correlation, and it makes it significantly harder, if not inconceivably harder, for an attacker to try and figure out what IP address broadcast a transaction.
Right.
Cool. So that's, you know, and there are further improvements to be made there. I mean, you know, this is always a cat and mouse game. We're never going to go like rubber stamp, cool, we're done with this. But at any rate, cool. So that's IP address correlation. Now, next thing, and the fifth thing, and this is very key, is having a large privacy set. Now, I want to just dial back a second because one of the criticisms that I sometimes see bandied about is Monero only has an anonymity set of 11 because that's the current ring signature size. It's going to be it's going to be increased with bulletproofs plus in the next 12 months, but currently, you know, it's ring size of 11, and so therefore it's an anonymity set of 11. Now, the reason that doesn't work is because you can't take an anonymity set on a single transaction. It's very rare that a single transaction is viewed as like, well, this is a bad transaction. We need to pinpoint where it comes from. Typically, they are, you know, a transaction might go through several, several paths or several routes. You know, you can imagine. Let's say that someone does something really bad with Monero. They've gone and they've bought, I don't know, they've bought plutonium to build an atomic bomb. Now, they've received that Monero from somewhere, but in between receiving it, maybe they bought it on Binance and they received it to their wallet, but now they might have done a bunch of stuff. They might have in between moved it between wallets, sent it to themselves. There's all sorts of things that might have happened. They might have gone and bought chewing gum on Takealot, and if Takealot accepted Monero, and now that's another transaction in the loop. So you've got all of the stuff that's happened between like the actual traceable thing and the bad transaction. And as you step back each time, you've got this like 11 to the power of 11 to the power of 11. Everything just keeps.
It just
exactly. It just grows exponentially. Sorry, 11 times 11 times 11, not to the power of. So you've just got this exponential growth, and by the time you're like, whatever, 10 layers back, like the anonymity set is so massive that you're not going to be able to figure out like where things come from, unless you have an extraordinarily large amount of metadata, and even then you would struggle. So it's important to understand that we're not talking about this on a per transaction basis. Another thing that's very important about this is Monero provides plausible deniability. So even if one of your transaction outputs, like let's say that you went on Twitter and you were like, I just made a Monero transaction, here's my transaction ID. Or I just received Monero, here's my transaction ID. And someone knew that those outputs in a transaction belonged to you. They knew it categorically because you openly admitted it. Now, one of those outputs was used in our hypothetical bad guy buying plutonium transaction. It was part of the ring signature. Now they come and knock on your door and they're like, did you make this transaction? You have plausible deniability because even, short of them actually like finding your wallet and being able to demonstrate that you did make that transaction, provably demonstrate it, you're just one of 11. So, they might suspect that you made that transaction, but well, firstly, have fun trying to find like the other 10 people. And, and secondly, like, even if you found a few of them, like, how are you going to prove that this weird cryptographic ring signature thing definitely points to you? So, plausible deniability is a very key element here as well, that even if you're suspected as having performed that transaction, there's no actual correlation. There's no objective correlation. Okay, so let's get back to the fifth thing now, anonymity set in general. So imagine you are running away from someone. You're running away from, and imagine you're in a spy movie, okay? And you're running away and you go into the subway, and you're in the subway and you do that like thing that they always do in the spy movies where they jump over the turnstile because no one's going to stop you from doing that. And turnstiles are apparently really easy to jump over in America. And so you jump over the turnstile and now you're in the station, but there are only 3 people in the station with you. And now the policeman, whoever's running after you, jumps over the turnstile too, and he's in the station and he looks around and he's like, well, there are only 3 people and that's the guy with the red hat. So, pretty easy to catch you, okay? But now imagine the same scenario. You jump over the turnstile and there are hundreds of people around you. Now the policeman gets there and he's like, because they're always overweight, in the movies. And he clambers over the turnstile and he's like, dude in the red hat. And he sees the red hat on the floor and he's like, there are hundreds of people. What am I going to do? Can't arrest all of them. Don't know what I'm going to do. I give up. So anonymity set really is about getting lost in the crowd. And it doesn't matter, even if you had the best privacy technology, even if in our little illustration, if everyone in the area wore exactly the same outfit and looked the same, it wouldn't matter because there are only 3 of you. So just arrest all 3 of them. We can figure out who done it later. Whereas if there are hundreds, it doesn't matter if they don't look the same because you're not going to be able to figure out, what are you going to do? Arrest hundreds of people? And then question them. You can do that, but you're just you're gonna end up finding a bunch of false positives, and it's just not really gonna help. So it really is about getting lost in the crowd, and Monero has a monopoly on the crowd at the moment. Maybe that changes in future, but right now Monero has the monopoly on the crowd, which means it has the greatest anonymity set, regardless of actual technology being used.
Yeah, a mate of mine, Sean, he did an Indaba, I think number 7. I asked him a question. He's like, what would you like me to ask Riccardo? And he's like, are there any ways to improve this ring signatures? And I think you're right here. It seems like people might criticize it, but it really comes down to this anonymity set you're talking about, the sort of like cascading.
Yeah.
And then with those two pieces of information, it's kind of like, yeah, do you really need to improve it?
Absolutely. And don't get me wrong, there are improvements coming along. So there's something called Triptych. Triptych. I always butcher the pronunciation. I don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced.
Like a good South
At
African.
any rate, yeah, there we go. Triptych. So this is, I mean, I reckon this is probably like, I don't know, like anything from 12 to 24 months away, because there's still a lot of auditing and I think a degree of comfort that developers and researchers need to have with it.
Yeah.
But Triptych is really wonderful because it would allow a ring size of like 64, 128. So very, very large ring sizes compared to what we have right now. And I think once you're at something like a ring size of 128, then even attacks with very large sets of data become inconceivably poor to execute.
Yeah.
So it's not, and again, I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, of course, if there's if something like ZK snarks become really trustless and compact, then that is certainly an option for the future. So we're always trying to improve privacy. We have one goal, and that is improve privacy while still retaining decentralization, security, and robustness. But the main goal is improve privacy. So if we see ways as developers and as researchers and as cryptographers, if we see ways of improving Monero's privacy, we jump at it. We don't go like, oh, well, that technology was created by Bob and we have a not invented yet syndrome and we don't want to implement it. We're very happy to implement superior technology as it exists. Of course, the bar is very high, both from a comfort as developers scenario, but also like just getting to that point where it meets our bar of like decentralization and and not having like trusted setups and that sort of thing.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, for the past year, I've spent sort of like my spare time, well, just developing out a new privacy preserving networking protocol. It's sort of my rant, my sort of anger. I miss the internet of yore, of old, where people just sort of got on, and now the internet has changed completely. It's like you can spoof, you can cheat, you lie. It's turned out into a spam fest, all of this sort of stuff, and it's just gotten me to the point where I'm like, okay, we now have major monopolies out there on the internet. They're data dissemination monopolies. How does one sort of like create a networking protocol that utilizes and learns from the best of what happened to with the TCP/IP stuff, the good lessons learned, and then also like what we need for a secure networking protocol that implements provenance, and has integrity, such that I can just have the data in my hand, and from that data alone, I'm able to determine if anything's being tampered. I'm able to determine that Riccardo actually created this data.
Yeah.
And more importantly, I want to do what Bitcoin and Monero does by taking a bank and shrinking it into your pocket. I want to do that with ISPs. So you take an ISP and essentially you shrink it into your pocket. So, but there's certain sort of trade-offs that come with that, because in order to do that, you do not have a God's view of the network. So it's not it's difficult to do routing at that point. So you can only, it's like a Chinese box. You can only see these envelopes. You can pass them in and out, right? So and the important thing to do here is to strip out any addressing information with TCP/IP or IP at all. You just completely remove IP addresses on the packet level, and in that way, you when you do that, essentially you're shifting the hourglass. Are you familiar with the hourglass of the internet?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So essentially you're shifting it away from IP addresses to named data, to named chunks. And then from that, that's a more sensible way of doing it, because then all of a sudden you're no longer limited to disseminating your data over TCP/IP. You can do it over Morse code. You can do it over lasers. You can do it over any sort of transport medium. Basically, you just create a plug system. Okay, this is my UDP, and you plug it into the router, and then it says, okay, well, I've got a new link that I can route data over.
Yeah.
And in that way, and then of course, I mean, when you layer this on, on a data level, you got a lot of flexibility to do stuff, basically. So you can do encryption, you can do both on the link level and also on the data level. It's just anyway. It was quite an interesting exercise, starting essentially from first principles, saying, okay, what have I got? I've got a request, I've got a response. Okay, let's build this up right up from the ground up. And it was, oh man, it was quite challenging actually. So I mean, when I saw this, I was like, oh man, I wonder if there's a way that it might be possible to maybe integrate that kind of technology into something like a privacy preserving currency. Now, I think that one might be interesting to do and to see. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. I think. I mean, I'm a big fan of stuff like Tor's pluggable transports, where the actual networking that happens doesn't care about the underlying transport layer. And I think that that's such a key piece of technology, because it's at the moment we're very bound to building things out based on like a way of thinking that's not. It's not that it's necessarily wrong. It's just that we're so used to building on the shoulders of giants that we forget sometimes to stop and take a step back and go like, this might change in future. And I think that that's one of the things that has prevented the rollout and deployment of IPv6 is just how much stuff is built on the assumption that that IPv4 will be around forever, that it'll never change, that like this is just the way you address things with these 4 little numbers with a dot in between. So, and I think that stuff like IPv6 and certainly Tor and ITP as well are challenging those assumptions, and it's good to see flexibility in software that is happy to route over whatever transport mechanism you have.
Yeah, like for example, in this particular case, when you design it such that there is no addressing whatsoever, you got your anonymity going there, your privacy preserving aspect. I suppose implementing a kind of dandelion, the stem and the broadcast at that point is almost trivial at that point on such a networking protocol.
Definitely.
So, yeah. Talking about you're one of the Monero is one of the very few projects which has a developer a contract, which I personally am in awe of. I really respect this approach of doing it, and I want to know, what's the story? How did this come about that Monero and also your project? You've got a project called Tari, I think. Is it Tari? Are actually utilizing this? What have been the pain points? Why did you arrive at this?
Sure. So, I mean, I've seen a lot of things like that's happened more recently, like projects having like code of conduct. And the thing is, like,
it's lame.
It's lame, and it's also like, why? Why are you forcing people to act in a certain manner? Yeah. So many years ago, when Monero was but a babe, and I was a newly appointed, for want of a better term, a lead maintainer. I'd worked on open source projects before that, but I'd never been a lead maintainer, and I'd never had to herd cats, as the saying goes, and had to deal with like a bunch of different developers who all have different ideas and different principles. And I was in Belgium, and I think it was Belgium, and Peter Hitchens, who's the creator of ZeroMQ. Peter Hitchens said to me, why don't you know, if you're going to do a Monero meetup, why don't you come over and do it at my house? So we had a little Monero meetup at his house, and hung out for a while with him and his family, you know, that evening, like deep into the night, and probably like late at night, like 11:30, you know, most of the people have gone, his kids have gone to bed, and it's just like him, myself, Binary Fate, who's another Monero core contributor, and a couple of other people, and we're sitting whiskey there. Yeah, pretty much. We're sitting there, and we're like, and I said to him, I said, Peter, you know, you have run a successful project. Zero MQ is a big project. You've run a successful project for a long time, and he's certainly had his share of issues. You know, I mean, there were like 2 developers he hired who eventually split off and forked Zero MQ, which then failed. And yeah, and I said to him, like, what? How do you do it? How do you build a community? How do you make sure that I mean, like especially a privacy preserving project, how do you prevent an attacker, whether it's a corporation, a 3-letter acronym, a government, whatever it is, how do you prevent them from just sowing discord in your community by having a developer legitimately contribute, but then, you know, start to be like weird and start to just sow little seeds of doubt? And he said, you know, we've got this thing called the C4. And I was like, what's a C4? And he said, it's the collective code construction contract. And I was like, huh, interesting. So I went and actually read it, and I was like, yo, you know what, this makes a lot of sense, because it's not a, it's just a, it gives you the ability as a maintainer and as a project and as a group to deal with problem children. That's really what it boils down to. It doesn't say, like, you have to use certain pronouns, or please don't use words like blacklist, or, you know, please don't have your own opinions. You can have your own opinions, you can do whatever you want, but if you become a problem child, it gives the community, the contributors, and the maintainers the ability to say you are no longer welcome here. And that is an incredibly powerful thing, because this collaborative code construction, collective C4. Code construction contract, C4, very, very heavily curtails any power that you might think you have as a maintainer, but it still has, like, you know, these sort of call outs to, like, when someone is really beyond the pale, and that I think is good, because it, even if it's never used, even if you never ever need to use those ejection clauses, it just keeps people in line a little bit, you know, that, like, you can do whatever you want, but if you're going to consistently be a bad actor, you are also consistently not welcome. And it goes into other things. It goes into, like, you know, specific requirements around patches, specific requirements around the development process. And again, I mean, these are not like hard and fast requirements, but it's nice to know that it exists. It's nice to know that, you know, when people start stepping out of line, because you're trying to collaborate as a very large group, hundreds of developers, all with different ideas and different coding styles and so on. It's nice to just be able to say to someone, listen, please, can you do things this way? It helps other people that later on need to maintain your code. Here's the C4, here's the rationale behind it. It would be great. So yeah, we've implemented that. We have tweaked the C4. It's not exactly as Zero MQ use it. We've made very small tweaks, nothing particularly dramatic. And I was very happy that Peter got to see us implement that. He passed away a few years ago. But it was nice that he got to see that his work was not just Zero MQ, that a lot of his soft skills ended up touching other projects.
Yeah, when Peter mentioned that he was going to be passing away, the gushing of you know, sentiment and you know, heartfelt. I was so surprised to see how many people he had actually touched. He was a hugely influential person, like even on a personal level for me, because I've known about Hitchens for quite a while. I came across his blog posts many a year back, and actually one of the clauses in the C4 is as a result of me. Yeah, I was like, hey Peter, this shit ain't going down. This is not working. We need to do some sort of thing over here. I think I forgot which one it was, but yeah, I mean, he's a real person to look up to, from the point of how to manage an open source community. But just, even from his early days, remember the patent. I mean, he was an advocate for getting rid of patents and whatnot like that. He used to play music and play songs and stuff about, great guy.
Yeah,
really great guy.
He was a character, and he was also what I loved about him is he was just like, he was opinionated in the best possible way.
Right.
Like, he was happy to have good opinions. He was happy to have wrong opinions too. And he wasn't like, well, he has an opinion that I hold with no substance. He was always happy to have a discussion and to justify it. And he understood where the thin edge of the wedge was, that like some of these things are so nuanced. It's not just black and white. And with open source software development, oftentimes it's very hard to distinguish between a legitimate contributor who's having a bad day and someone who's out there to destroy the project. And he understood that. He understood the difficult game that you're playing.
Yeah. But it's sort of like his understanding took a very, very surprising turn when he wrote The Psychopath Code. That book was that helped me through a number of relationships issues I was having. And when I just sort of gave him feedback, it was just like, dude, thank you so much. You have touched me in a way that I just cannot even talk about. It's yeah. And in many cases, like I'm now at the point where it's like, if you've got a very serious, like, big open source project, or are you with a group of people, all the leaders need, in my opinion, should read that book. Have you read it?
Yeah.
It's
very impactful.
It's mandatory in my word.
It is. And what's fascinating to me is definitely in the cryptocurrency space, there are a lot of projects that have decentralization theater. They talk a good game about being decentralized, but if they're still centralized in a very real sense, and they actually have no path to decentralization. Because one thing I learned from Peter as well, ZeroMQ is a wonderful example of a project that had a benevolent dictator but had a path to decentralization. And I don't have a problem with a project having VC roots, taking on funding, doing all. No problem with that. Every open source project starts with a central component, but how do you become decentralized from that? If you start off with the assumption that you are the development team and you're always going to be the development team, you are really going to struggle. And when someone disagrees with you, then either they get kicked out or they fork the project, and it's very difficult to really decentralize. You end up building this cabal of yes men and women who like cluster around you and just agree with everything that you say for fear that it doesn't work out. So I think that's the wrong way to do it, and I'm definitely I'm a big fan of like high integrity agreements where you make a high integrity agreement with yourself and your early contributors to decentralize things, where you talk about it, you talk realistically about things, you talk realistically about how to step back from things, and you also share the load. You shouldn't do things in secret. You shouldn't be the guy who knows how to access the thing, or the person who knows how to do a release and no one else does. Like, where's your documentation on that? And to that end, something we did recently is we had a security incident on the Monero, on the server that hosts Monero downloads a while back. And coming out of that, we realized, well, A, we needed to set up new infrastructure that was a lot better hardened. But B, why did we actually keep all of our stuff secret? Like, why didn't we talk about how the server was configured? Then maybe we would have caught some of the security snafus sooner. And so now we have an entire document on how the Monero server is configured, exactly how all of the security measures that we take. Obviously, it doesn't have like passwords, private keys in, but literally, if the Monero server goes offline tomorrow, someone could take that guide and set up an instance of the Monero server and harden it just as well, which I think is, it's just testament to again, Peter's influence in terms of how to run an open source project, how to be open about and transparent about how everything runs and is set up, and not to be that central point of failure.
You should convert that script from a human language into Nixos.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about security as code and about infrastructure as code and so on. And I think we use Docker extensively in the configuration, but yeah, I'd love to get to a point where it's a lot easier to spin that up, where it's just a matter of like, run this and everything gets done for you.
Yeah. I've had plenty of good experiences with Nix. The learning curve can be a little bit high and a little bit annoying.
Very much so.
Oh, you've looked at it, huh?
Yeah, so now but it's well worth it.
Yeah. So now your time is sort of split between Monero and your new project, which is Tari, right?
Yeah.
How do you manage this, Superman?
So the trick is exactly what I just said. You pass stuff on to everyone else, and you just like, it's actually been really, really good to see, because I must admit, at the beginning, when I started handing certain responsibilities over, I started with like stepping back as the maintainer of the Monero site and the Monero GUI, letting other people handle that. Then eventually, like, okay, cool, like stepping back as the maintainer of the main Monero software repository, and seeing that first release where I had nothing to do with it, that very first release where someone else put it out there. I mean, we've got reproducible builds, so but still, someone else tagged it, someone else wrote the release notes, someone else put the release out there, they loaded it onto this, they got it on the server, someone else signed the hashes. Like, seeing all of that just happen. I mean, yeah, okay, I documented stuff, so it's, they certainly were following my documentation initially, but like, it's just great to see. It's wonderful to see. And the past like 2 major versions of Monero, I've had no involvement in the release.
The baby's working.
I've not needed to do anything, and so now I feel very free, because I can hold opinions in the Monero space. I can, and in the ecosystem, I can comment on issues. I can open issues. I can, I can take action where I need to, but I can't. I don't have undue influence, and I don't have undue control, and that is very freeing, because it means that if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, doesn't mean anything for the Monero project, and no one puts me on a pedestal and looks up to me as directing where the project should go, which is so critical, because otherwise you end up with this like Euro complex, and that's incredibly, incredibly dangerous. This cult of personality that so often exists in open source, and particularly in cryptocurrencies, is very dangerous.
What I find amusing is those people who fully embody the cult of personality, but then on the right hand they say, "Oh, cult of personality is a bad thing. It's not a good thing." Yeah. And I think you already know there's quite a few people who are who who I'm probably referring to.
100%. It's and you know what? It's very difficult to. You've got to take this stance publicly, but you also need to really believe that you're not that you're not the personality people should build around. And maybe you need to purposely do some things that anger people. I've certainly done stuff that's angered people in the Monero community. You've got to toe this line between being loved and hated, so that no one views you as a cult leader or as a leader of any sort. You're just one of the people with a loud voice.
Yeah. So So, okay, you freed up your time. You've documented everything you need to do, and now you're working on a Tari. And
Yes.
of course, it's probably self-funded at all your own thing. And
Not actually. We actually have VCs that have thrown money at it. I guess I finally got to the point where someone took me seriously. I don't know why, but
Jesus.
but it's what is nice though is it is sort of it shows a tacit approval and a change in VCs that actually building privacy preserving software is now something that they're interested in. I can't imagine VCs being interested in building privacy preserving software even 5 years ago.
I mean, just the other day, was it Silbert? He tweeted 2021 is the year of privacy. And I was like, whoa, shit.
We're mainstream now.
yeah. Like, okay, well, where's all this money then?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what is Tari about then? Like, it's okay.
Yeah. So Tari is a decentralized assets protocol.
Oh.
So one of the things that and it's built on top of Monero, and there's a reason for that. One of the things I spoke about earlier is the need for transactions in Monero to all look alike, to be indistinguishable. Yeah. And so when you want to do something like you want to start getting fancy and you want to do stuff like scripts and colored coins and digital assets and that, you can't do it on Monero because otherwise you're going to end up with metadata in transactions that make them distinguishable from others, and that's problematic from a privacy perspective. But of course, there's been lots of people have said like, why doesn't Monero have smart contracts or digital assets or whatever? So I've been thinking about that for a long time, and I did have some idea initially. I wanted to just inject data into Monero transactions, which is really easy to do, but you do hit this issue of like distinguishability, which is problematic from a privacy perspective. So myself and my business partner Naveen, we spoke about it at length, and we were like, well, what if we built it as a separate chain that's merge mined with Monero, and we have atomic swaps between the two, so that anyone who wants to do smart contracty type stuff, not really smart contracts, but stuff that's geared towards like creation of digital assets, whether it's in-game tokens, in-game assets, tickets, loyalty points, security tokens, anything you want to do that is like not just a pure financial transaction, you can now do on the side chain, and you can peg in and out of Monero as you need. So that's kind of where it started conceptually, and it doesn't. Tari isn't trying to have the same privacy approach as Monero. It's Mimblewimble, or it's based on Mimblewimble. So there's maybe I would argue a larger focus on scalability, but with privacy trade-offs. So it's certainly not. I can't imagine anyone saying like, "Oh, I want to use this over Monero for privacy reasons."
I think.
Need
okay.
from the.
Wait.
There we go.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. I think there was a bit of breakup. You said you can't imagine anybody using.
Yes. Cool.
Continue.
I can't imagine anyone using Tari over Monero for privacy preserving reasons because the trade-offs are very different. And there's other decisions we've taken, like we've made decisions around the language that we use. Monero is written in C++, Tari is written in Rust, so that contributors don't go like, oh, well, like I'm.
This is the first technical glitch. We've lost information. I'll fill it in now. Riccardo mentioned that his company Tari, what they do is they take Rust people from different programming languages, maybe C++ or C, and then they pay them to go work on the Rust project called Rust Lightning. This gives them an overview of how to write decent Rust code, as well as it gives them a lot of information on how to structure layer 2 technologies on top of Bitcoin. And yeah, pretty much we just started to touch on what layer 2 is. But later in the Indaba, Riccardo will expand on what layer 2 is. So round about now we can continue with the Indaba. That's all that was pretty much lost. Did you hear that, by the way?
Yeah, I did.
Now, what the hell happened there? I wonder why that happened. Let's hope that doesn't irritate us again. Okay. Layer 2. It's not. Yes. It's a centralized entity where you put all your transactions, and then that is the settlement layer. Continue.
Yes. So Lightning, I think, does a reasonable job of having something that is reasonably secure, reasonably private, reasonably robust, and reasonably decentralized. It's not perfect, but I mean, like, I think it's a good first stab, and improvements will either be made to Lightning, or someone's going to come along with some better design in the future. And I think that's either way, it doesn't really matter. Like, whatever is successful, whether it is Lightning, some iteration of Lightning, or some successor, it doesn't matter. But layer 2 systems are imperative and are so important from a privacy perspective, so that we don't end up in a world where, like, every single transaction is on chain, which is not a viable thing from a scalability perspective, and is not great from a privacy perspective.
Actually, in some ways, Tari is layer 2. So
100%. That's exactly how we've architected it.
So it makes sense with, like, okay, well, here's an existing project which has got good things, and this is a good way to go. You go learn over there in that little sandpit, and come back to us with the lessons learned.
Exactly.
And okay, good way. Okay, and then keep going into Tari, I suppose. I mean, surely there's a lot more to talk about.
Absolutely. So Tari, like I said, makes different architectural choices to Monero on purpose, and the idea really is that down the line, when someone comes along and they want to issue some sort of asset, that they have this as an option, where it builds on top of Monero security, and of course privacy is something that we care deeply about, and so the ability to issue an asset and decide just how private you want that asset to be is important too, because there might be, for whatever reason, there might be a need to have asset transfers and issuance and so on very much non-private. I mean, certainly maybe certain collectibles need to be non-private. Maybe some security tokens need to have no privacy. Totally understandable. Have the ability to operate that way, but make the default that you're creating an asset and it uses maximal privacy. So really, like, total blind asset issuance and transfers, and that's really, like, I don't know if, like, digital collectibles and digital assets are the future, but I think they're definitely an area of interest to me, and I think that we are going to end up in a tokenized world, at least on some levels. I mean, sure, I don't think everything needs to be tokenized, but I think it is nice to know that there are certain things that could be tokenized. Like company shares are a great example. I think security tokens are wonderful because it would allow for all sorts of interesting things to be built. At the moment, if you have an investment in a company, let's say you have an investment in a startup, there's like no price discovery on your shares at all, unless, like, there's a subsequent raise or there's an exit. And so that becomes, you get these like weird OTC deals being done for, like, startup equity, and even if it's a very successful startup, until it's public, it's problematic. And so having a share, having a security token instead of a share would be interesting, because now you could have a proper trading environment where people are actually exchanging those for real money, and you would have all sorts of price discovery based on that. And it would mean that if you needed to take your shares and you needed to borrow money against it, you could actually do that. Because right now, if you invested money in even a very successful startup, like, you go to the bank and you're like, I'd like to take out a loan for these shares I own in, like, this company, they're going to be like, No. But do you have a house that you can put up? Because that, that will take as collateral. But now if it's a digital token, then you can borrow against it because the price discovery is obvious. And you can, like, there are already decentralized lending systems, and doing that against security tokens is certainly something that I find extremely interesting.
Yeah, talking about borrowing against digital tokens and whatnot. It looks to me like Bitcoin's entering its now, was it third or fourth hardening, should I say? And the narrative around it seems to have changed a bit. It's become now more of a something that you plug your treasury into, basically. Are you on board with this this idea?
Yeah, that's a good.
You're aware of what I'm
It's a good
talking about,
question. Yeah. I feel like and I say this with with all due care, because I always get flack when I comment on Bitcoin. It doesn't matter what I say. I do feel like Bitcoin itself, like when I say Bitcoin, I mean like transferring Bitcoin on the blockchain like normal. I'm not talking about layer 2 systems. I'm not talking about transferring Bitcoin via Lightning. So transferring Bitcoin on the blockchain, normal layer 1 stuff, I feel like that's gone from being a payment layer, and that's certainly not to say that people don't use it as a payment layer, but I think we're moving away from that to it being a settlement layer, to it being a wealth preservation layer. So, stuff like calling it digital gold is very real. It's like in the literal sense, like digital gold. You wouldn't take a gold bar or a gold coin and go to Starbucks and be like, hello, I would like to buy some coffee with my gold bar. I'll take 3.5 million cups of coffee. Can you provide change in silver bars? Like you wouldn't do that. It's nonsensical. But you might go, well, I don't want to store cash, and I've got enough money in my bank account, and I'd like to store some of that as gold. That if that gold bugs exist en masse, and there's certainly nothing wrong with having some gold in your safe. And I feel like Bitcoin is like it's that, but just immensely more powerful. And that's kind of where we're going to, and it's good because I don't think that there is value in having cups of coffee purchased on the blockchain. I think that, go to Starbucks 1,000,000 times a year and pay them with Lightning, and let that end up being one settlement transaction on the blockchain rather than, millions of stupid little transactions. So that makes total sense to me. I also kind of think it's a good it's a better narrative than this is a payment system. Build the payment system on top of it. That's exactly how it's worked traditionally. And I think that there's value in that. Don't get me wrong, I'm happy to disintermediate banking and so on, but I think that we can take some lessons from that. The banking system was built on top of the gold standard. Could we do something like that in a decentralized way? Where we're still disintermediating. We're not introducing intermediaries, but we are using Bitcoin as a settlement layer instead of using Bitcoin as the payment layer.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm starting to. For example, are you going to convert at least your company's treasury into Bitcoin? Would you? Yeah.
Yeah, we already have Bitcoin on our balance sheets across all my companies. And it's not something that we talk like publicly about because I don't see a need to. But
okay.
We would be remiss if we didn't hold Bitcoin on our balance sheet. And it's I can tell you it has caused complications. We sold an asset as like one of my companies recently, and we sold a property, and we wanted a bridging loan so we could buy Bitcoin, but we wanted a bridging loan because it's going to take like 3 months, okay, for that property to transfer and for us to finally get the money. So we were like, okay, let's get a bridging loan, because bridging loans are not particularly high interest rates, and we can buy Bitcoin with it. But as a company, okay, we've got reasonable cash flow, but they were like, what collateral do you have? What assets do you have? And we're like, oh, we got Bitcoin on our balance sheet. And they were like, no, what real assets do you have? And we're like, what? Like, it's a bridging loan. Okay, the money is currently sitting with the lawyers. So, what risk do you possibly have? And B, we have like a Bitcoin on our balance sheet that is like 3 times that. Like, it is like the lowest risk loan on the planet. And the bank was like, no, we need real assets as collateral. Or you need to sign surety. I was like, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah. No, I think the future is going to. I think once Bitcoin's valuation exceeds that of silver and gold, and eventually property, that's when you're going to start to see these banks like going, oh, okay, we'll do that.
Yep.
But it's looking more and more like Bitcoin is going to eat the central bank's lunch.
Yep, I agree.
And then in some ways, one can create a future whereby anybody can create a layer 2 bank and plug it into Bitcoin. This kind of, it sort of reminds me of the banking system in Germany. Now in Germany, they've got thousands of different sorts of banks. Small banks issue loans to small businesses. And the backbone of Germany are these small businesses that manufacture these great high quality stuff all over the place. Whereas in the case of like the UK, everything's a big bank. All the small banks are being, obliterated, absorbed. So by having this, like sort of, how can I say, Bitcoin bank layer 2.0 kind of thing, it's like, yeah, okay, Riccardo, you want to create a bank? You spin up your own little bank, plug it into Bitcoin, and you can issue any layer 2 coin that that particular community might be interested in and are willing to circulate in exchange for value. It's kind of interesting to see what happens. And then you see the ECB, what's her name? Lagarde or something? What's her name?
Oh yes, yeah, the French little girl. Oh, that was the funniest to me. I mean, she's like, Bitcoin's being used for funny stuff, and a few years ago she was like, facing a prison sentence, like for stealing money. I mean, that is like irony on irony. Like that is like those in glass houses should not throw stones. The pot calling the kettle all sorts of colors. Like it was deeply ironic.
What a fucking joke, man! What a fucking joke. Not only that, but as for the central banks, God, they print the hell out of this money. They're talking about funny business, my ass, Jesus Christ. Anyway, so yeah, this is the first group of people who are gonna really get it. So anyway, that's kind of a fun thing. How would you go about architecting a layer 2? For example, let's talk about this hypothetical scenario whereby, let's say, not talking specifically Tari, you're pretty knowledgeable about layer 2 stuff, in the sense of creating open source software that allows anybody to essentially create a bank. So it would be, this is what I'm looking at the moment, and I'm thinking of how I can create the software and layering it on top of my networking protocol, so that anybody can download this open source project, and you can collateralize a loan, which would spin up this peer-to-peer currency, and the end users would just like log on to your website kind of thing. Maybe it might be centralized. I'm not sure how to architect it just yet. And then you can make these transactions between people within this particular community. With my networking protocol, it should be a lot easier to decentralize. But how would you go about doing that? Do you see a need for it, a market for it, or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, look, so layer 2 systems are very interesting, but I think that interoperability becomes important. I think that it's, in other words, if you think about, let's go back to the example of paying at Starbucks. If you think about it, like right now, you've got literally tens, hundreds of thousands of people going into Starbucks all over the world every day, swiping credit cards, Apple Pay, whatever, cash. They're doing all of these things to pay for cups of coffee. And ultimately, there's money that ends up coming back into the Starbucks bank account or bank accounts. And with that, they're able to pay salaries and pay rent and so on. And the interoperability layer there is really the bank account. Like it becomes like slippage becomes an issue, and there's an issue with the friction that's introduced when you have to go like, well, we've received all of these funds, and now in order to pay our bills, we need to move into like 16 different other systems. So I do think that there's, when building a layer 2 system, there's some concern and consideration that needs to be given to interoperability, which is why right now I'm sort of focused on, apart from the Tari stuff, when it comes to payment stuff, I'm very excited about Lightning, because I do think that it provides a good foundation, and there's so much stuff that can be built out with Lightning. And Lightning has not even begun to touch the surface of interoperating with other chains. There's some work being done on the Monero side to allow Monero to work with Lightning. First step is to have Monero Bitcoin atomic swaps, which are busy; they're in progress. And I think that there's so much stuff once you start using that that you can build out. Because imagine Lightning not only as a payment rail, but also as an interoperability layer if it comes to other chains. You start to see how there's so much stuff that you can do there without needing to even branch out anywhere else. You could build a layer 3 on top of Lightning quite easily.
I've been avoiding Lightning for some reason. I don't even know fully how it works, actually, but it just feels like it feels a little bit dodgy some way. I don't even know why. I don't know why, but it sounds like this is something I should be taking seriously.
I think so. Look, I certainly don't know. I can't tell what's going to happen in the future, but I do know that there is a sufficiently high degree of intellectual energy and actual development funding and work that is being done on Lightning to make it worth investigating. I know that I've read a lot of criticisms. I've heard a lot of criticisms. I've used Lightning extensively myself over the past few years, and I don't see any of the criticisms as holding water long term.
Okay.
I mean, it's like the criticisms of Monero. Like, yes, absolutely, those criticisms might have been valid at some point, but the criticisms are certainly not always valid. And as long as there is a steady drumbeat of progress,
right,
then those criticisms get dealt with and get met. And about the only criticism I've heard of Lightning that it has even a remote degree of legitimacy is that it's taking a long time to build out, which is, open source software, it takes a long time. Like, so what? That's the way it works. One thing I do really like about Lightning, which I think is very, to me, very fascinating, is that there are at least 3 major implementations, and they're all interoperable. Now, you can't do that easily on the base layer.
Just wait. Okay. You can't easily do that on the base layer.
You can't easily do that on the base layer. There are alternate implementations of Bitcoin's software. There's BTCD, for example, which is a Bitcoin node written in Go. The problem is that if there is even a very small nuanced implementation niggly. I don't want to call it a bug, just like some little implementation detail that BTCD is implemented slightly differently because of the nature of Go versus C++, then you could end up having a consensus failure. And this has happened in the past with Ethereum, where Geth and Parity have disagreed on how the specification is implemented. And so ultimately the truth is in the code. Now, with Lightning, because it's a layer 2 system, you don't have consensus, at least not in the same, not in the way we think of consensus in decentralized systems. So you have this node software, these three different implementations, which are written in different languages, and they're able to interoperate, no problem. So I think that to me is also kind of fascinating, because it's something that you can't easily do on the base layer, but certainly on a layer 2, you can do all sorts of cool things like multiple implementations and multiple areas of development being done simultaneously.
How does Lightning work?
So Lightning works. I mean, I guess the best way to think of it is it's like swapping IOUs. There's IOUs flowing around, and these IOUs end up adjusting a balance that's held in a channel, okay, which is like you're committing Bitcoin into that channel. So now it's committed there, and you can't spend it on chain because it's committed there. And now you're just swapping IOUs back and forth. And what's really clever about Lightning is the routing, okay? Because routing is, of course, another challenge. In a layer 1 system, you can just flood full, right? It's like, here's my transaction, broadcast to everyone that I'm connected to. They broadcast to everyone they're connected to. Everyone in the network sees it. But now in Lightning, you want scale. So you don't want to do that. You want to be able to do millions of transactions a second, which means your routing needs to be point to point. So how do you do that? Well, onion routing. And that's the way Lightning shifts transactions around. It's just onion routing. It's like, here's my node. There's that node over there. I can see the path that I need to take to get to that node. So here's the packet with all the onion layers. And then I just send it to that node. And it takes it, peels off the layer, takes its little payment, sends it to the next node. It peels off the layer, takes its little payment, sends it to the next node, till eventually it gets routed to the destination. So there's a whole bunch of like scalability and privacy stuff baked into Lightning, which is very interesting.
This is fascinating. I wonder if there's a room for a competing Lightning thing, a Lightning layer 2.
Absolutely.
I should look into this.
Definitely do not hold the opinion that Lightning is the only layer 2 system that will ever exist. Yeah. I think that there is absolutely scope for other systems to exist. It is, Lightning has a lot of attention at the moment. That's a good thing. There have been there's been research papers on alternatives, and at some point, someone's going to like create something that's similarly unique, and put some development effort into it. And I think it'll be good. It'll be good to have alternatives. You never want to have a scenario where there's only one system, and well, if that thing breaks, you're in deep trouble.
Yeah. But it does sound like going back to the original thing you were saying, like layer 2. The main issue with layer 2 is that everybody needs to convert all these different sources of money into a bank account. You anticipate Lightning to be that sort of converging point.
I think so. Yeah, I think it's potentially a point of convergence. It might not end up being a point of convergence. I know that there are others who are doing interesting things on interoperability between chains. I haven't really looked into like Chainlink, but I've heard some people have whispered it into my ear and said I must go and like look at the actual tech that's being done on Chainlink, and not be distracted by the Chainlink army or the Link Marines or whatever they call themselves.
What?
Trying to shill the stupid token. I mean, like, no one cares about the token. Like, focus on the technology. It's always distracting when you've got a bunch of bag holders. But
yeah, that is so true. And being in the space for quite a while, it's just enough now, guys. Enough. Let's just get on with it. I suppose from a technology point of view, I mean, we've covered quite a lot of ground there. Tell us more about yourself. So you're living in, what's it? Where is it in South Africa you live?
So I'm in Plettenberg Bay.
Plet.
So yeah, along the southern coast. Lovely. Yeah, so I mean, I come from a tech background. Started as a developer. I went through a stage where I always had side hustles, and I went through a stage where I didn't know if I wanted to be a developer. I mean, like, being a developer was paying the bills. I was making, there was certainly some success that I was seeing. I was being promoted. I was being treated well. So I enjoyed that, and I enjoyed the big paycheck that came at the end of the month. But I didn't know if I wanted to be in IT. So I did a bunch of. I mean, some of my side hustles in the past have been, like, I had an events production company, and we did, like, comedy evenings at the Blues Room in Village Walk back in the days when that existed. We had Trevor Noah on, like, before Trevor Noah was famous. I think we paid Trevor like 1,000 rand to do the headline slot. Big money.
No, actually, Trevor Noah, David Kibuka. Actually, David Kibuka went. He works with Trevor Noah. He was in my year in high school.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
nice.
we grew up together. But it's very interesting. Like, I mean, these guys are bright guys. They could have gone on to do like high paying jobs, but they started out with comedy. And I'm telling you, in the early days, these boys suffered. They suffered, man. They would, like, but now look at them.
Yeah, no. I remember once, like, we were struggling to get a payment from a venue. We took a split of the door, and we were struggling to get a payment from them, and so we couldn't pay the comedians. And man, like, they hounded us because it was, and I understand it. The comedians hounded us, and we were like, what do you want us to do? Like, we're waiting for the payment. Like, we're pushing the venue. There's nothing we can do. And just, like, having to deal with, like, them phoning, and, like, I mean, I think we cut out again. There we're back.
No.
Okay.
No. Oh, okay. At least my side, you were fine. Keep going.
Cool. It's just dealing with them, like, I mean, like, eventually phoning and begging, and, like, saying, like, they need to pay rent. Like, it's a rough industry, and you're at the mercy. We're at the mercy of the venue. They're at our mercy. It was a rough industry, and I did that for a few years, and I didn't, there were parts of it that I really enjoyed, and there were parts of it that I hated. The dealing with, like, the comedians are great. I loved them. Dealing with venues, not so much.
Well, now you're in a position to set up your own damn venue.
Yeah, exactly. I could have wanted. But yeah, so I ended up getting into Bitcoin in early 2011. I started an import-export business, which gave me a lot of flexibility. Started it with my wife, before she was even my wife, and that did pretty well, and it gave me a lot of flexibility. So I stumbled across Bitcoin May 2011. I read an article on Slashdot, and it was about this Google engineer who was building a library for Bitcoin. It ended up being Mike Hearn, building Bitcoin J. So, thanks, Mike.
Controversial figure.
Oh, very much so. But I was like, well, if a Google engineer finds this Bitcoin thing interesting, maybe it is interesting. And I started digging into it, and my first reaction was, you know what? This consensus thing is not going to work. There's no way it works. I will break it. I will break it. I will prove that it is broken. Yeah, like 6 months later, I was like, yeah, this consensus thing is really interesting, eh? Turns out it's not that trivially broken. I mean, again, like a lot of, I'm the sort of person where I will read something like that, and I'll go, like, yeah, I mean, I think I've got an understanding of it, and then I'll just make a bunch of assumptions on that, because like that's as one does, and then I'll go about setting to prove or disprove my assumptions, and I kind of need to dig in and do that. I'm like, I can read the white paper 17 different times, but it's still like I needed to actually knuckle down and try and do it myself in order to really have an understanding of, like, how the thing worked. So it was good. It was worth digging into. And then, of course, after that, I thought mining was the interesting thing, like, because we have such cheap electricity in South Africa, we don't. I was like, this is great. I'll just, I'll mine here with our very reliable and very cheap electricity. Meanwhile, it's not reliable or cheap. And that was an interesting experience too. I mean, like, I did that for a while, and then I thought to myself, you know what? Okay, cool. So electricity in South Africa is neither cheap nor reliable. So instead of doing this, what if I became like the guy who sells spades and shovels? I mean, axes and shovels in a gold rush. Instead of mining myself, like, what if I built stuff for miners? And so I did. I built a bunch of tools for miners. Eventually, designed a flat packable, stackable open air rig for GPU and CPU miners.
Oh, right.
And this was
so hardware as well as software.
Yeah, exactly. So this was like 2012, 2013. 2013 was when sales really started to pick up. We had a lot of success, had a lot of fun. And then, one of the big challenges we faced there was shipping from South Africa was very expensive. And if you did the cheap shipping, then it would take 3 months. So yeah, we had to deal with like lots of angry customers, and also some who were very happy. Ended up getting, supplying these frames to mining farms, and that kind of like killed the retail segment. I didn't really, like, I can sell 100 frames to a mining farm who's willing to pay the air freight cost, or I can sell 2 frames at a time to Joe, who's going to complain about the price of shipping and then the time it takes. So yeah, it was like that was sort of 2013 for me, and ended up ended up with that the design being knocked off by like a bunch of guys in Asia, and they sort of cornered the retail market a bit, which was fine. I mean, like, we were at that point in time, we were almost entirely selling commercially and not really doing much in the way of retail sales. And that was when I discovered Monero. Was sort of early 2014 by one of the guys that was working with me in the mining, the open air, or was called open rigs. One of the guys that was working on open rigs with me pointed me to Bitecoin, which eventually then pointed me to Monero.
Yeah, Monero is a bit of a scam project at the time, wasn't it?
It is, yeah, and I'll definitely get into that. Okay. But at the same time, something else that happened in parallel was we were obviously, like, 2013. There were a lot of people who wanted to pay with all sorts of cryptocurrencies. They wanted to pay with Litecoin, they wanted to pay with Feathercoin, they wanted to pay with Vertcoin. You name it, they wanted to pay with it. Like, all of these weird little cryptocurrencies, Peercoin, of course, they wanted to pay with them, and there wasn't much in the way of a payment gateway. Coin payments existed, but they were super sketch at the time. They subsequently have become much better, and I quite like some of the stuff that coin payments is doing. But at the time, there wasn't really anything that could do more than one currency. And that was very frustrating to me as a vendor, as a merchant. And so I was like, well, if that's the case, I'm just going to build my own. So I started a payment gateway called Paybe, and then eventually we rebranded to Globy. And Globy still exists today. It has its own CEO now. I don't do any of the management there, and it's doing really well. So yeah, I mean, building it was the right move. And that was a lot of fun. I learned so much about payment rails, about traditional fiat payment rails, and credit cards and all sorts of stuff. And yeah, that's going extremely well. We have some high profile clients. We process all of Purism's payments. So if you go into Purism and you purchase one of their privacy enhancing laptops or phones, and you pay with like Monero, it goes through Globy. So yeah, it's nice. We've built some good relationships in the industry. They're having a lot of fun doing it. I'm no longer involved, obviously, in the day-to-day management, but yeah, it's definitely been a lot of good fun. And yeah, let's talk about Monero's history. So,
so sketch.
So sketch. So Monero is interesting. Basically, what happened was there was this group of people. We don't know a lot about their background and history, but they created something called CryptoNote. And that's the white paper that Monero is based on.
Right.
And so the CryptoNote white paper was basically like, all of these things, all of these ideas based on Bitcoin to some degree, like architecturally, transaction outputs, transaction inputs, and so on, but introducing some other ideas like ring signatures, dual key stealth addresses, and so on. And then they had a reference implementation called Bitecoin. Here's what was interesting about it. What they had done is they had created Bitecoin, they'd written the code, and they had created like 2 years worth of blockchain history with very, very few transactions, but still 2 years worth of mining, blockchain history. And then they put a bunch of sock puppets on Bitcoin Talk who discovered Bitcoin in the wild. And the idea that the story that they tried to sell was, this is a currency used on the dark web for 2 years, and that no one's heard of. But for 2 years, it's been used on the dark web. No one's heard. Everyone in the Bitcoin space, out of all of the thousands of people, tens of thousands of people on Bitcoin Talk at that point, none of them used the dark web. It was such an illogical, inconsistent story. And, they would set up these sock puppets. The sock puppets would go like, yes, I am a dark web user and I have used Bitcoin for many years. And it would be like, oh, cool. So who are you? Can you point to like a GitHub repository? Can you point to like previous discussions you've had on Bitcoin Talk? Because it looks like you've existed for a month. So, like your claim is kind of meaningless. Show me someone who is known. Show me a Bitcoin developer. Show me someone who's been in this space for a year who can say, yes, I know about Bitcoin. Anyway, they couldn't produce anyone. So then one of the guys that actually is part of CryptoNote, but we didn't know this at the time, pitches up and says, "Oh yeah, okay, I'm going to do a fair relaunch of Bitcoin, because obviously this having 80% of the currency pre-mined or secretly mined is nonsense. So I'm going to do a fair relaunch of Bitcoin. I'm going to call it BitMonero." Now, BitMonero, Monero in Esperanto means coin. So literally BitMonero means Bitcoin. Anyway, so not the world's best name, but anyway, like fair relaunch, great. So I was like, at the time, everything's really frothy because it's early 2014. I'm selling these open air frames. I've got this payment gateway I've built, and so I'm like deeply entrenched in the altcoin space. And I'm like, oh, cool, a new altcoin. Of course, this is going to like go crazy. I now have the ability to mine a bunch of it, and I'm just going to wait for that. I'm going to wait for it to hit Poloniex. That was the big thing at the time. It's going to hit Poloniex. The price is going to skyrocket, and I'm just going to dump all the stuff I've mined. That was like my initial attraction to it was just like, okay. I was attracted to the fact that it was privacy enhancing. I was attracted to the fact that it was not Bitcoin's code base, but I was just like, I'm going to mine it and dump it. That was the appeal, because that's the space I was in. Like all of the mining I was doing at the time, was new Bitcoin fork with a stupid no features, just a new mining algorithm. We're calling it X72, and it's 72 different hashing algorithms smushed together, and that's totally fine. And you just mine it, and then you mine it for a month, and then you wait for it to Poloniex, and then you dump, and you go, ha ha ha! I've made so much money. I'm so clever, So, that was the only thing that altcoins are good for. And as I started off mining Monero, and there was a point, like especially in the first couple of weeks, where I was like a third of the hash rate. So, there were a few of us that were mining very heavily, and we discovered an improvement that could be made to the hashing algorithm. So we realized that the CryptoNote developers had purposely crippled the hashing algorithm, obviously to give themselves an advantage. And we found this out within a few weeks, and so we pushed this code change up, and everyone started mining much faster. And of course, the poor CryptoNote guys, suddenly their hash rate dropped from like whatever, a few, like 10% to like 0.5%, and all of our hash rates went through the roof. So it was a lot of fun, and I started falling in love with Monero because I was like, this is a fresh code base, and it's different, and it has these different ideals, and no one else was picking up the gauntlet, to do anything. So we were like, trying to work on it, and the guy who launched Monero, BitMonero, thankful for today, was like, he was like the benevolent dictator. Now, like 4 weeks into it, he says to the community, okay, guys, so what we're going to do is we're going to be merge mined with Bitecoin. And the community's like, what? No, why would we do that? Like, A, mining just fine, thanks very much. B, Bitcoin's a giant scam. So why on earth would we want to be merge mined with Bitcoin?
Okay,
that makes like
mining just fine, very much.
Oh yeah, we were mining Monero just fine, thank you very much. And B, why would we want to merge mine with Bitcoin? That's a giant scam. So hard pass. And he was like, no, well, like, okay, I hear you. Let's put it to a vote. So he put it to a vote by making miners vote, and he did it using the version number, the block version number, the miner version number, and he set the default to yes. So of course, like he pushes. Jesus. I know. So he pushes the code out, and we're like, bro, come on. What are you doing? So then he's like, oh, haha, silly me, ha ha ha. Okay, fine. I'll change the default to abstain. So he changes the default to abstain, and then like over a weekend or whatever, all the miners vote for like no. And he, I mean, like except for like there were 2 blocks he mined or whatever. And he's like, like when the vote ends, and he's like, well, you know what? I'm going to do it anyway. And we were like, that was the point at which we realized, okay, guy's not a benevolent dictator. He's just a dictator, and that's not appealing at all. This is not the sort of person that we're going to be able to work with as an open source project. And so myself and 6 others, so 7 of us, decided we're going to fork BitMonero into Monero. Also because BitMonero is a dumb name, and Monero is a much better name. and the two ran in parallel.
Damn it.
His implementation wasn't able to sync.
Yeah, well, yeah. Okay, so the 2 ran in parallel, and his implementation wasn't able to sync.
Yeah, so after about a year, his implementation stopped syncing. So that was, kind of poetic justice, and he disappeared. I mean, like I think his last login to Bitcoin Talk was June or July 2014. And so now we had this thing where, like, yeah, okay, I'd mined a bunch, and certainly, profit was a motivation. But at the same time, I suddenly realized we had this open source project with a captive community, and everyone was like, hey, so what now? And we were like, I guess now we make this thing work. Now we crack at it. We didn't really know what to do. It was like, I mean, you can imagine, and I've described it like this before. It's like having a little baby left out on your doorstep, and you're like, oh gosh, what am I gonna do now? So yeah, you kind of suck it up, and you go like, well, I guess I'm an open source maintainer now, and like we sort of like. We faffed around a little bit. We didn't really know what we were doing. We didn't know how the code worked. There were no comments in the code. They'd purposely stripped the comments. We didn't, like, even the white paper, there were parts of it that were like a little bit over our heads. Like, I mean, we had a reasonable grasp on the cryptography, but it was still, there were lots of unknowns. And so we just started like I think we all individually, and we didn't know each other, by the way, like the 7 of us that forked the code, we weren't friends, and we just like started working on it because we didn't have another choice, because we didn't want to see the thing die. And yes, some of us had mined, and so we didn't want to see the thing die from a profit perspective, but also I think the larger motivator was like, hey, this is actually a piece of software that's not terribly written. Okay, yeah, they stripped out the comments, but it's not terribly written. It's fairly stable, and it actually it's an alternative to Bitcoin in a very real sense. You want to talk about altcoins. Forking Bitcoin does not create an altcoin. it just creates a very boring fork of Bitcoin's code, and you can slap whatever features you want onto it, but it doesn't make it interesting. But having something with a fresh code base, that makes it interesting, because it means that if there ever is a critical break in Bitcoin's cryptography or in Bitcoin's code base or something like that, that there is this alternative that exists. And yeah, I kind of fell in love with like the idea of a privacy enhancing alternative to Bitcoin, and I wouldn't describe it as a competitor or a successor, although I certainly have heard people say stuff like that. I disagree with them, but I just think as an alternative to Bitcoin, as a hedge, as a thing that exists, it's worthwhile.
Well, it does use different cryptography, different curves. There's
Very much so.
a series of decisions that went into that process to deliberately do that hedge, as you're saying. What sort of were these done post this guy leaving, or what?
No, so a lot of those fundamental decisions, like the elliptic curve and the hashing algorithms and so on, that are used in the creation of addresses, like all of that was decided in advance. So and a lot of that was dictated in the white paper. And then some of it was just done in code. Yeah, like using curve 25519, I think it was an excellent decision. We knew it at the time, but I think we know it even more so now, that there's something to be said for Daniel J. Bernstein stuff, that it seems to be about like as unpoisoned as you're going to get in cryptography.
I use that too. I actually did some research just to see whether I can actually integrate with Monero on that level, but yeah. It feels like you are not doing a pure. There's some stuff. There's some other stuff on there. I'm not too sure. I didn't have time to go into it, but it's not.
Yeah. So there's
got some layers on. Am I right?
It is. It's like EDDSA. Well, it's a flavor of EDDSA, I guess, is probably the best way to describe it. Yeah, it's not like pure. I mean, it is pure X25519, but it's not ED255 or 25519. There's some differences there.
Okay. Yeah, well, yeah. When I saw that, I was like, okay, incompatible. Damn it.
Yeah, I think there will be, like, there's definitely a movement towards changing that in future. But if we're going to change to anything, it'll probably be Ristretto. Ristretto fixes some of the small nuances with X25519. I like Ristretto a lot. We've contributed back to the project and done some stuff there. So,
talking about attack vectors, I want to ask you. How do I phrase this? Cryptocurrencies, their threat model is the state actor, and I won't put it past the state to actually going down to ISP level to filter transactions, to do all these sorts of things. What do you think is the likelihood of a desperate state actor doing this? And are they able to technically do this? The reason why I ask is because as I mentioned, I've just finished this networking. Well, in the process to completing this networking protocol, this privacy preserving thing, and I think it would be a great way to be able to ensure that transactions are able to get to miners, even on alternative or alternative internet lines. So you set up.
Yeah.
And so what's your opinion on ISPs being able to filter, for example, Bitcoin transactions, etc.?
So I think one of the things is when you're building permissionless software, you have to assume that the threat model is an attacker that is just extremely, extremely well-funded, very resourceful, very adept. So you have to sort of imagine that the most powerful nations in the world are pitted against you, because that's your threat model, and whether it's true or not is irrelevant. I mean, you can't build it any other way. You can't say, well, our threat model is that, like some corporation might think that this isn't fun. You can't say that your threat model, or like, is some 16-year-old kid in Poland. Like, you have to imagine that your threat model is a state-grade attacker, and that has access to like ISPs and that. So yeah, I think a couple of things there. The first is a state-grade attacker would have to get the would have to get the what's the word I'm looking for? Like, they'd need to work with a lot of other states, firstly, so nation states. So yeah, maybe we're talking about Five Eyes, okay, and maybe all of them go like, well, Monero is bad or Bitcoin is bad. And let's block it at a traffic level. And the challenge is, like, firstly, even if Five Eyes had to all agree that Bitcoin is bad or that Monero is bad, like, they don't have like the Chinese Great Firewall, so they're not going to be able to do that. They're not, this is assuming they even agree in the first place, but they can mandate, like in Russia. Russia is a great example of this. In Russia, they don't have a firewall on a national level, but what they do have is a box that or a set of hardware that every single ISP has to install, and they do have the ability to, and they've gone after ISPs in the past. They can punish ISPs legally for facilitating what they think is banned content. So, this, like Russia is a great example of how this could be done without needing a national firewall. And yeah, you have to think about that in your threat model. So, like, on both the Bitcoin and the Monero side, there are a lot of things that have been done in the past. Things like Blockstream Satellite certainly plays a role in ensuring out-of-band distribution. Things like Locamesh is working on Monero support, and they have been for a while. And they did a whole crowdfunding thing using Monero's crowdfunding portal, and so there's a lot of stuff like that. There's also a good old sneaker net, being able to like pass transactions on flash drives and that. So I think that there's like it's very difficult to stop. And there was a quote from Satoshi, which I thought was kind of interesting. He spoke about how Bitcoin only needs one country that is free, like one country where it's not banned. And oftentimes we don't think about it in that context. And I can read you the quote. Here we go. He says, the IP address of most users are totally public. You can use Tor to hide this, but the network won't work if everyone does this. Bitcoin requires that some country is still free. So that's really, I think that Bitcoin and Monero are already built to handle that threat model of sort of even a semi-global movement against it. And I would be very surprised, just practically speaking, I would be very surprised if even the supermajority of countries could agree that Bitcoin or Monero is bad and that they should implement extensive technological measures against it. I think far more likely is if a supermajority of governments felt that Bitcoin or Monero or both are bad, they would just outright ban it. And that would immediately mean that all of the companies that provide or that facilitate the exchange from fiat currencies to those digital currencies would immediately cease to operate, or at least cease to serve those countries. And the other knock-on effect is that ordinary citizens would view it as something that they shouldn't touch, because most ordinary citizens, I mean, the pandemic really has highlighted this. Most ordinary citizens, when the government says you do something, you do something. And those who don't follow get thrown in prison, as an example. And so, whether you agree with the regulation or not is irrelevant. Most people will follow the regulation, and there'll be a handful of people going like, I don't care about the regulation, I'm going to carry on using Bitcoin or carry on using Monero. But it will become one of those things where using it, using it is like the outlier. Using it is like a big red flag. You don't talk about it. You become criminal just by your very nature. And it's certainly not a. I'm not saying that won't happen, but I think that we're at a point now where governments have accepted that these digital currencies can and do exist. And I think that instead of banning it, they would much rather find ways of policing it and getting their tax money. I mean, if some trader is making millions of dollars, the government's like, hey, share. They'd much rather get that tax money than ban it, and not just a trader, but organizations that are facilitating cryptocurrency services. Like, governments want them to pay taxes. That's all they want, and I feel like that's that's really where we're headed. Is governments cracking down from a tax perspective, not cracking down from a legality perspective.
Now then, it becomes quite difficult for them to prove how much tax you should pay. These people are used to a level of control whereby they can just inspect your bank account, and
exactly,
and giving up that control or forcing it out of their hands, it's they're not going to go kicking without a kicking and screaming. And I think also from another perspective, it's the central bankers, which are they're the slave drivers. They're the ones that crack the whip, and all the banks listen. You will print this much money because we want to do X, Y, and Z. Their ground is going to fall away beneath them, and I just don't see them going away quietly.
No, you're right, but I think that so what I suspect is going to happen is and look, I mean, again, I have no insight into the future, but I think we're going to see like CBDCs, central bank issued digital currencies. I think we're going to see CBDCs being positioned by central banks as an alternative, and they will just go like, cool, you can use Bitcoin, no problem, or you can use the digital dollar or the digital rand or the digital whatever, and there will be a lot of people who will be like, cool, man, that's awesome. It's like Bitcoin, but it's also digital. That's cool, and it's the rand and the dollar and whatever. But I think that it's going to sneak up on them. And by the time it happens, it'll be too late to change. And I'll give you an example of how this could happen. So, as someone who's been in the import-export space for a long time, you end up dealing with China a lot. Okay, and that is where most of the manufacturing on the planet lives. And when you deal with a Chinese manufacturer and they want to get paid, I have in over a decade of import-export, I have never had a factory in China say, please pay us in yen, or please pay us in euros. They want to get paid in dollars. Now, if the dollar starts weakening significantly, how long until those Chinese factories say, please pay us in Bitcoin, or please pay us in Tether? I don't know. But I mean, it absolutely could happen. And you could see how overnight it could change the flow of funds into China very, very subtly, but very quickly. And that would change the US dollar's position as a global reserve currency, because maybe the US dollar remains stable in the face of that. It would give it a lot less utility. And so that's kind of where I see things playing out. The other thing to consider here is why does anyone buy Bitcoin right now? I mean, and I'm not necessarily talking about like companies, but just think about like people. When your hairdresser or your mechanic buys Bitcoin, they're not doing it because they want self-sovereignty. They're not doing it because they want to hold an alternative to their local currency. They're doing it because they think they're going to get rich. It's the only reason. And you know what? Appealing to human greed is actually Satoshi's the cleverest thing that Satoshi did. miners are built on the appeal to human greed. Half of Bitcoin's game theory is based on greed, and it means that, like, eventually a lot of the alternatives to Bitcoin, and I mean centralized alternatives to Bitcoin, will capitulate because they cannot offer what Bitcoin offers, which is an appeal to greed.
I think it's more than just appeal to greed, but it's getting the Nash equilibrium right, such that if you are greedy, this thing works.
Exactly.
I mean, that is sheer genius. As soon as I sort of like came to an understanding of that, I was just, oh my God. And when but you have introduced a new perspective there for me, is that regarding these Chinese manufacturers who would just like, nah, we don't want to US dollars anymore. Give us Bitcoin or Monero or something like that.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's a very good, if I can communicate with my mates in China and sort of get them to sort of like, hey guys, spread the word, stop accepting US dollars.
I have had those conversations in the past, and I continue to have them with factories and manufacturers in China, and it is, I think that, like, what's wonderful about Donald Trump is
oh Jesus.
Yeah, I know. What's wonderful about Donald Trump is he has done untold damage to US-China relations.
Yeah.
To the point where if the US said to China, listen, your factories are starting to accept Bitcoin, you should ban Bitcoin, the Chinese would go like, no.
Preparing to...
There we go.
Okay, so Trump has done untold damage to China, and then
And I just think, I mean, and listen, I say that facetiously and with humor, but I do think that the opportunity for the US to pressure China into banning digital currencies has passed. China is skeptical of digital currencies, but they have not outrightly banned them. And I think that once the Chinese central bank issues their own CBDC, which it seems is actually imminent or on the horizon, when that happens, it's going to create greater acceptance of digital currencies in China. And I think we're going to start to see manufacturers and factories be open to being paid in alternate currencies. Or at the very least, we might see something like China's CBDC trading on the open market against Bitcoin. And then, the manufacturer saying like, cool, pay me in Bitcoin, I'll just use this exchange to settle locally.
Yeah. And then after a while, they're like, actually, this Bitcoin seems to be the world's, most rarest precious asset. Maybe I won't convert.
Exactly. And that's the value, right? And then suddenly it gets like the rug gets pulled out from underneath central banks in a way, because you're right. I want to make this point because I think it's important. Governments have tanks and guns and bombs, and they are not going to accept a financial coup. It's not on their radar, and they will defend their home turf using that. But Bitcoin is able to play a regulatory arbitrage in a way that nothing else is. And that means that they have very little choice but to accept it as an innovation that is not going away. Whether it is something that they hate or not is irrelevant. It is an innovation. It's going to be around for a long time. They would be better off accepting and taxing it than trying to fight against it. Otherwise, we just end up with another war on drugs. Where it's taken like, it took Europe a little while, but it's taken the US even longer, and now they are eventually they've capitulated, and they've realized that the war on drugs has just been a ridiculous waste of money. And if you look at Portugal, where they decriminalized drugs, it reduced drug usage. So like go spend your money elsewhere. Go spend your money taxing drug users. Don't spend your money stopping them. Go spend your money taxing Bitcoiners. Don't spend your money stopping them. And I think that that's the future.
Recently, I managed to wangle my way into an interview with a BBC journalist, and I managed to get I wanted a single line in there, in the article, and I said, and it was about the Chinese CBDC, and essentially I said, no, this CBDC and the philosophies between this CBDC and Bitcoin are completely different. And then I said, the point of Bitcoin is separation of state and money. And I wanted the journalist to mention similar to the separation of religion and state, but he was like, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. You know, we got readers all over the world. You know, like look at Muslim countries, and you know that wouldn't work very well. But anyway, so my hope is at least from this level, like if when interacting with government, it might be a good idea to mention, you know, the separation of state and money, like the state and religion, because then they start to realize, oh, okay, actually, maybe it's not a bad thing at all.
Yeah, and I think it's certainly interesting, you know, and I've spoken about this at length in the past. The idea that governments have gotten to the point where they, and it's actually, I don't know if it's government so much as law enforcement, where they expect financial institutions to do the policing for them. And I feel like that's a very dangerous situation, because, you know, if you think about it, like right now, if you go into a bank or deal with a financial institution in the US and you have $10,000 in cash, they file something called an SAR, a suspicious activity report. And like for what? You know, they file it because you smell funny, or because you transacting with this amount. I mean, it's a little bit crazy. And if you think about it, like just dial back 40 years, 30, 40 years, there were no digital systems for banks. You know, banks did like, they would literally have like a dude driving with like checks or whatever between them, and before that they'd have a dude on, you know, going like from town to town with a carriage and bags of cash and gold and whatever. But at the same time, over the past like 150 odd years, has law enforcement been incapable of enforcing the law? Have they not been able to catch criminals? Are they only able to catch criminals now because of, you know, the fact that they have access to all the flow of funds digitally? I would argue that things were probably safer 150 years ago than they are now, you know, and I think that that's testament to the fact that law enforcement have always been able to do their job by identifying suspicious people and actively surveilling them, and by getting tip-offs, anonymous tip-offs, and by having criminal informants and so on. They've been able to solve crimes, and our ability or their ability as law enforcement agencies to solve crimes has improved. The technology to analyze DNA and to, you know, to actively surveil someone, to track their car, to put bugs and cameras and whatever in their house, that's improved massively. So why do you need a passive surveillance net as well? And if that passive surveillance net goes away, does that necessarily hamper your ability to enforce the law? I would argue it doesn't. I would argue that the law can still be enforced just fine, and that law enforcement agencies can be very comfortable with with losing that passive surveillance net in favor of stepping up active surveillance.
Yeah, and I would also go as far as to say it's not just the financial institutions that are expected to do the policing now. Now we're seeing more and more of these these data dissemination monopolies like Facebook, Twitter. They're also doing a similar sort of thing where now it's like the law has become the TOS. What the hell? What the hell? And maybe we can go into that. What's your opinion on all of this? These data dissemination monopolies. How would you go about dismantling them? How would you go about breaking them apart? Or, I mean, if you even see a need for that.
I mean, yeah. So it's a good question. They're kind of frightening and kind of painful to break apart, because people have become very lazy. They're quite happy to provide all of their personal information to Facebook as long as they can continue to play Farmville, and message their gran.
Dude, that was a while ago. Things have changed a bit.
but it's no. But you know what? I mean, you're right.
But
things have changed a bit.
Yeah.
Things have changed a bit, but things have changed because people are starting to wake up. I mean, like, take a look at this recent WhatsApp privacy policy change.
Oh, dude, I'm deleting that shit.
Quite frankly, the privacy policy change is actually not even as bad as people are making it out to be. But it was just a trigger point. It's a trigger point that has been a long time coming. People have started to feel the heat from giving all their data over to organizations like Facebook and Google. And you couple that with how frothy things are in the world politically, how people maybe feel a bit unsafe. And then WhatsApp makes a change to their privacy policy that might be a little bit, they might think it's benign, and everyone loses their mind and switches to like Signal and Wire and Telegram. And you know what? It's good. Yeah. It's good because I feel like that Schelling point, that straw that has finally broken the camel's back, has been coming for years. It has been a culmination of hacks and leaked data, and then Facebook being embroiled in all sorts of scandals, like the Cambridge Analytica one. People have been building up to this point for years, and I think it only gets better from here. There's going to continue to be this drumbeat of privacy breaks and of people moving away from organizations. And there's going to be a continued drumbeat of organizations like Apple saying, hey, we provide better privacy than Google. And that, I think, love or hate Apple, I love the fact that they have made privacy a selling point. It's made it acceptable for large organizations to use privacy as a selling point.
Dude, I'm fucking buying an Apple Mac. I can't believe it. I've never owned one, and I never wanted to own one. And then like the attitude that they've got towards privacy, and I was like, fuck, this is getting harder. Yeah, I know it's a little, crystal walled garden, but
yeah.
And also that M1 processor is done pretty.
It's the M1's very nice, very lovely. It's very fast. But you're right. I mean, it's like it's and don't get me wrong. I'm sure Apple are going to make missteps. Sure. I'm sure they're gonna do things, counter to their mission and have to self-correct. But at least they are making it their mission. Like in all of this, where's Facebook and Google? They're just like, oh well, we've made a page where you can disable things.
You bring up a really good point, because just recently, Apple had a networking library or something, and then they sort of gave a whitelist. Certain Apple legit stamped applications may communicate without going through a firewall. And then one security researcher was like, well, maybe I can sort of get one of these authorized applications to communicate data over this thing. And lo and behold, it wasn't that hard. And as a result, the Apple guys were like, okay, everything goes through the firewall now. So when I saw that, I was like, all right, guys, I think you got it there.
No, they do. And it's, it's definitely, like, if you look at how they take privacy to heart, because people pay for their services. That's the other thing, right? People don't pay for Google, so Google's like, well, we're not getting rid of your data. No one pays for Facebook, so they're like, we're keeping your data. They rely on advertisers to pay them. Yeah. So until they change that model, until they throw that model out, and become more like Apple. It's going to be tough for them to change.
Yeah. So this particular area is one of my real hot topics. Do you know which is the biggest ISP in the world with 0 customers?
No.
Google.
Really?
Everybody peers with Google. All the data goes through Google. Google is the basically the traffic cop, the operating system. The internet is no longer this hierarchical internet that we used to have 10 20 years ago. It's now everything is all consuming. Google is like a black hole for information.
Yeah.
And this is the primary reason why I started this networking project of mine, and to try to allow people to be their own ISPs. Because when you do that, it's like I can create. It's like Sailor uses an example of like that Jurassic Park. When you get a number of these tiny little dinosaurs, and then they come and you look again, and there's 32. You look again, there's 64. You're gonna die. You're dead. You're fucking dead, man. All of these dinosaurs, these tiny little dinosaurs are just gonna get you. So I mean, I think for me, the fastest way to dismantle this silly valley tech giant data dissemination monopoly clusterfuck is purely to do what Bitcoin did to banks, and you have to do the same to ISPs, so you can bring it down to your own level. And well, there's a whole bunch of problems that are involved in that, but yeah, that's the way forward, at least for me. That's what's keeping my time occupied, at least.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's quite a terrible thing. What's going on at the moment?
Yeah, and I just think like I think that it's I'm surprised it's taken this long for people to start waking up, but at least they are.
WikiLeaks was pivotal in giving us all that slap awake, and more so how the state treated Assange to this day, right? I mean, actually, WikiLeaks and the Cyprus haircut, they were my two aha moments. I was like, oh, right, okay. Like WikiLeaks is now able to dodge this embargo by using Bitcoin, but it's a little bit of a pity, because that was the point when Nakamoto was like, Assange, please, can you please don't use this shit. We're not ready for it, man. We're not ready for it.
And you know what? He was right. Hey, I
Totally.
think like I think Bitcoin, if WikiLeaks hadn't done that, Bitcoin could have probably done with another year or two of development before anyone really started doing something like that, and it might actually have ended up gaining some privacy. I think the regulatory pressure has definitely contributed to the very slow development of on-chain privacy on Bitcoin. But at least there are guys like Samurai Wallets are trying really hard, and they're doing great work. And I think that Taproot will also help to some degree. So yeah, let's see. I think that it would be good to at least have some privacy options on Bitcoin. Just generally speaking.
What's your opinion on having a Turing machine on top of Bitcoin?
I think the problem with that is scale. I think that the issue you face is if you're going to have that form part of the consensus mechanism, then every single node needs to validate that Turing machine. The state changes. So I'm generally opposed to doing that as a layer one. I think that you can do a lot of that at layer, on a layer two, where it isn't a consensus mechanism. Where you could build a federated model on layer two, for example, and all sorts of stuff where you still have consensus, but you don't need to have global consensus for state changes. So there's lots of cool stuff that you can do, and I think that both Bitcoin and Monero are good bases to build stuff like this on.
I've always seen use your treasury as Bitcoin, but when you want to spend, use Monero, because it's got the lovely properties of cash, right?
Yes.
And Bitcoin doesn't really. So I mean, I in some ways kind of would like to see. I know it's not possible, but like Monero being a layer two for Bitcoin.
Yeah, I hear you, and I think the atomic swaps between Bitcoin and Monero will help with that. That's making good. That's like making good headway, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that that becoming available in the coming months. And I think if you think about it, yeah, absolutely. I can totally imagine a scenario where, let's say you have $1,000 in Bitcoin. I could totally imagine someone taking $100 of that, putting it in Monero in a wallet on their phone, and spending from that.
No, I mean, going as far as to say, well, okay, Richard Werner, Professor Richard Werner, he's the guy who wrote, who was part of a documentary called "The Princes of the Yen." He's an interesting fellow. You should actually look up some of his stuff. He was based in Japan, and he was studying how the central banking systems were doing their stuff. Anyway, he opened up a chapter of monetary history and existing banking systems to me, which I was a fervent cryptocurrency supporter. I was like, yeah, screw the banks, fuck the banks all the time. But now I actually see validity in what they do. Maybe it's just I'm maturing, I mean, in the sense that you have a bank who would read a business proposal and say, or a successful person who has a large amount of Monero. And they say to you, okay, good. I will give you a loan in Monero after reading this business proposal, and you need to collateralize this loan with Bitcoin. I don't know. Like, I'm still mulling this idea through. Like, obviously, I mean, Monero has its own value in itself, but you want to collateralize that loan. Do you see what I mean? You want them to. What's your thoughts on this area?
Sense. Yeah, I mean, I think that crypto as collateral is an area of interest to me as well. I think like if you think about like the approach that a lot of people have taken to Bitcoin in the past, it's been like, well, okay, I bought Bitcoin at this price, now I'm going to sell it, and I'm going to pay tax on that sale. And I'm like, why? I mean, like, what if you were able to borrow funds against it, and the collateral still exists? The collateral doesn't go away. And now, if Bitcoin goes higher, you're able to either use a portion of your collateral to settle the loan, which I think has very different taxable consequences or tax consequences than selling it. But I think that alternatively, you can just pay the loan back. The loan's denominated in dollars or rands or whatever, and then your underlying collateral remains yours.
Yeah. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. So much work that needs to be done for this thing to be able to reach the common person on the street. But anyway, many bites will eat this elephant eventually.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the questions have sort of been answered. Well, we did go into the community consensus, the C4. That was an interesting subject. Can't really think of anything else. How's South Africa at the moment? We'll wrap up shortly.
Lockdown level 3. We're not allowed to buy alcohol. I don't mind. I have a stash. Yeah. But you know what? I mean, I lost a friend of ours, passed away on Sunday from early Monday morning from COVID. So it's starting to hit home. It's starting to definitely hit home. One of our staff has lost 7 family members. So it's from that perspective, it's like I am not a big fan of lockdowns, but like at all, I do feel like there's been a lot of overreach here. But I'm also personally extremely conservative, and I can understand why a lot of people aren't being conservative, but it's sad to see the consequences. And I'm very curious to see, not only in South Africa but worldwide, I'm curious to see what comes out of this. When we are all vaccinated and this thing is gone, what are we left with? Because something that I've been thinking about is, remember in 2001, when September 11th happened, and then the TSA happened, and the Patriot Act happened, and all of the stuff went. I mean, prior to that, I traveled with a penknife on me in the late 90s. Never got confiscated.
Me too.
You know, now it's like if you have nail clippers, they're like, inspecting them to see if you might use that. You're not allowed to carry tools on the plane in South Africa, which is very funny to me because they confiscated some screwdriver bits from me like a couple of years ago. And I said to them, they were like, you can't take this on the plane. And I was like, what am I going to do? Dismantle the seat and take it out with me? Like, what do you think I'm going to do with screwdriver bits? So on the 1.5 hour flight from Cape Town to Joburg, I'm going to dismantle the plane inside out. Like, explain this to me. It makes no sense. So at least the TSA allow you to carry tools, because I think that's a little bit silly. But I think just given what we were left with post September 11th, I am curious to see what happens after this. Do governments want to retain control? I mean, do they become so used to having the ability to, having the military on the streets, at least in South Africa, controlling where people go, that we end up in some countries in a dystopian future, or are they able to let go? That to me is very curious. But some good things that have come out of this is just the general adoption of work from home. I'm really grateful that that's happened, because I think, I used to travel a lot. I used to travel every week, and not needing to do that anymore. It's taken a bit of getting used to, but not needing to do that anymore has really been a benefit. And I think that we're starting to see more and more now that people can work jobs remotely, obviously, like primarily like IT and certain creative roles and so on. But we are starting to see it where before people were like, no, you need to be in the office so I can control you as a boss, so I can make sure you're not messing around. And now, not only are employees having to grow up and learn how to cope with distraction, but employers are having to grow up and not try and micromanage their staff. So it's we're going to come out with a different world, and hopefully one that is changed for the better, and not one where governments have enjoyed their taste of control so much that they want to keep it.
Yeah. One of your first lockdowns, actually, I think it was your first lockdown, hit the news out here in Hong Kong, where one of your soldiers, one of the South African soldiers, was walking through the township, and a fellow was walking around without a mask, and this soldier walked up to him in a very sort of aggressive manner and gave him one flying fuck slap. And that particular shot was on the Hong Kong news. Now, Hong Kong, I'm sure you've been to Hong Kong. Have you?
Yeah.
Have you been? Yeah. Everyone was like, oh my God, that's how South Africa deals with a lockdown. And I was like, what's wrong? I mean, there was no guns involved.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just, like one solid slap, and that dude, I promise you, is still wearing a mask today. He probably goes to sleep with the mask on just in case.
Yes, exactly. Oh, it's fantastic.
But I think I do think South Africa definitely has a different environment to a lot of the world. I mean, like the slums and the tin shacks with 6 people living in a shack. You can't expect them to stay indoors all day in the summer, in the heat of summer. It's just not feasible. So, yeah, certainly a lot more challenges than some other countries. And I don't, to be honest, just speaking more generally, I don't envy being a government in an environment like this. I
just finished editing this Indaba, and I noticed that information was lost at the end. Sadly and annoying. So this will be the last time I use Jitsi. Possibly also South African telecommunication networks are to blame here. Thanks, Telkom. Lifelong hatred I have with you. The information that was lost was basically pleasantries exchanged between Riccardo and myself. Riccardo, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate the Indaba. Look forward to the whiskey we're going to have next time I'm in Plet, or next time you're in Hong Kong. Take you around, meet the people, smoke a cigar, if that's what you're into. Everybody, thanks so much for listening. Have a good one. Bye.